The country certainly needs to be a lot more unified if it's going to survive.
For Americans, the stakes are just very high.
That's probably one of the few times that I deviate from my libertarianism is when it comes to the protection of our children.
The job has gotten a lot harder because you're doing more with less.
Progress is progress, and there's a lot of people working to make that progress happen.
It's either this or I have zero options.
I grew up knowing that the police were the most dangerous people that you're going to encounter.
You know, these things are just normal life.
Hello and welcome to Unpacking America, the podcast Unpacking America one conversation at a time. My name is John David Eastling and I am your host. By the end of this episode, you will have reached the halfway point of Season 1. Tremendously exciting, and hopefully you're starting to get a bit of a feel for what the show is about. We are talking to literally everybody we can from the US, no matter what their background, their beliefs, their history, all of it. I want to know it all because this country is wild to me. It seems to get wilder every day. I have to stop reading news articles because it just makes me scratch my head and go, what is going on? And I get a lot more satisfaction out of just talking to regular people and hearing their perspectives and their stories than I ever have from listening to a talking head on the news. So that is exactly what we're doing today. Today is a little bit more of a personal story. We're staying away from politics today. We're not getting into any of that sort of stuff. It is just one man's journey growing up in the US. And before we get too deep into that, I'm just going to do that cringy, awful podcast host thing where I ask you to like, subscribe, and leave reviews and all the other good things. And make sure you're telling your friends and your mum and your dad and everybody else to jump on and listen to this wild new podcast. All right, that's it, I promise. Cue the music.
It was just something that you just didn't talk about. I didn't share my status with anybody because I was afraid that I was going to be judged. I did feel that shame. Yeah, and again, I was just fearful that at any point I can be caught somehow and be deported.
For better or for worse, depending on who you talk to, immigration is what made America the country it is today and what continues to shape it into the country it's going to be. But not everybody experiences immigration equally. And the longer I stay in this country, the more I've been made very aware of how privileged I've been through my journey, based on the country I emigrated from, and let's be fair, a few other factors as well. My journey into getting a green card and being able to legally live and work in the US took 2.5 years from start to finish. And it was the hardest 2.5 years of my life. The person I'm going to talk to today, Rudy, it took 38 years before he became a permanent resident of a country that he had known since he was 3 years old. So this story is a story about survival, it's a story about making things work, and it's a story about being a person who calls America home, but America doesn't recognize that person, at least not for a large part of his life. And that is all the preamble I'm going to give, because this is not my story to tell. It's Rudy's. So assume your favorite podcast listening position, and let's start unpacking a very personal American story. All right, Rudy, thank you so much for joining me today on Unpacking America.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So it's not something I'm super well aware of, but you're part of, I guess, a group of people in America called the Dreamers. Is that right?
Yes, that's a term that, that was coined to refer to people with my sort of immigrant profile. Came here at a really young age.
So what does that that immigrant profile essentially just means you were a child when you immigrated?
I think the criteria, if there is one, would be that you had some sort of formal education here from somewhere in between K through 12.
Right. So when your family moved to, and your family came from Mexico, that's right?
Yes, we are from a little town in the state of Jalisco. That's approximately, from what I hear, 3 to 3.5 hours at most from Guadalajara. It's a little city by the name of Zapotiltic. But yeah, I don't really recall much in what I do. It's more of a dream sequence when I think of events. But yeah, that's exactly where my family immigrated from.
And what was what was the motivation for moving to the US?
Well, just, like most people that immigrate here, specifically from Mexico, at least I could speak about that, and the stories that you hear is just looking for a better life. My mom was a single mother, didn't really have my stepfather, or I should say my father, because he's the only father I've ever known of who was consistently there. So she had to basically make ends meet, along with aside with my older siblings, just selling food or selling candy, whatever she could actually buy big quantities of and then sell. And then my brothers would actually sell bread from the stories I hear. And my sisters would clean houses and wash clothes. And that was all just working together as a team to make ends meet and just be able to feed all of us. And, my mom just realized after a while that it was only going to be a matter of time until, everybody just branches off to, live on their own. And then it's going to be even more difficult for her to stay afloat, especially at a little city where there wasn't much room for economic advancement. So my mom had some siblings already that had immigrated here to the US in the early 70s, I believe. And they were already here legally, and you just suggested for her to really think about moving to the US. So that's what, motivated the whole situation there. Just hardships back at home that eventually led my mom to realize, like, you know what, since I don't have the support of my husband, then I really need to look for myself and my children. And that's when she made the decision, after hearing this advice from a few of her siblings, to move to the US.
Well, it sounded like she already had some good family networks established in the US already.
Yes.
So she makes the decision to move you and your family, which is how many kids? 5?
No, we're actually 8.
Wow.
There's
So
8 of us.
so she picks up 8 kids and takes you guys across the border. Did you fly in? Did you drive in? Do you remember?
Well, the thing is, it wasn't all of us at the same time, because just to provide more context for the listeners as well, is that I am the youngest of these 8 children. And there's about an 8-year gap between myself and then the next sibling. So my oldest sibling is 18 years older than me. He was already married when I was born, from what I hear, and had moved out of the house. So I've never lived with him, with the exception when we first came here to the States, because he had already, before my mom even was here, my brother came here with his wife, I think a year before us, which I failed to mention as well, that besides my aunts and uncles, a few of them that were here, my brother was the first one to make that after. And then my mom, just, I guess, already knowing that my older brother with his wife was here, was even further motivated to move up here to the US.
Did any of the family stay behind in Mexico, or did everybody come?
Oh, yes. That's the thing, that we all trickled in at different times. I remember very vaguely that we arrived from Jalisco, from our little city of Zapotiltic, to Guadalajara via train. And part, I think there was some point where we took a bus, but again, that's really, like, those memories are more of a dream like than anything. So I don't know how much of it is just, kind of false memories here and there, or stories that you hear when you're growing up, that you paste things together that you feel you might have lived. But from what I recall from that is that, yeah, my brother was here, and eventually my sister met us up in Tijuana. That's where we actually arrived, at my grandma's house, who was already living there with my grandpa. And my 2 sisters crossed the stereotypical way, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying it, meaning that through like a coyote, from what I hear, and That was their trip, as well as my brother who came here with his wife that I mentioned earlier. And as for myself, though, since I was so young, one of my aunts was also my godmother, and my godfather, her husband, just during the 80s, that was basically early 80s still, 83 going on 84. The immigration back then wasn't what it is today when it comes down to the vigilance and the thoroughness that happens when it checks for documentation. So back in the day, they just put me in back of the car. And from what I was told, this I don't recall, they told me to basically state that there were my parents. So that's basically the way that I made my way here. But again, that specific time, I don't really recall much about that. But yeah, my story was that I just came right through the border. Yeah, not much detail about that. They were just, you just came with your uncle and aunt through the car. At least that's the story I was told.
Right. When you say your sisters came via a coyote, what does that mean?
That means that there's people, I guess that's the name that they give them. Their profession is to pick up people at a certain point in Mexico and cross them over the border. And there's different, I guess, ways of doing it, either through the river or through like crossing at some point like the freeway. But again, I hear that there's different strategies that they use, but basically they're the ones that take people that are undocumented and cross them across the Mexican US border.
Which sounds like a really dangerous way of doing it, if I'm being naive.
Oh, definitely. It wasn't. My siblings, when it comes down to these stories, they don't really talk much about them. And when they do, they just say that it was just terrible being inside of, I have heard where they were put inside of trunks in situations where they felt, especially my sisters, were teenagers during that time, felt threatened and scared that they were gonna, be in some way abused, either,
Yeah.
physically and but they also even emotionally. So yeah, it was just something that was very difficult for them, but they felt that that was what was needed in order to get an opportunity at a better life.
So you're the only one really of the family who grew up in Southern California. The rest were, I guess, had gone through childhood before arriving
Yes.
here. So what was that experience like growing up in Southern California when the rest of your family grew up back in Mexico?
Yeah, that was difficult at times, especially just the language barrier going to school here. I was put through the ESL program right away. At least having older siblings, they taught me how to read and write and count, and they were trying to teach me multiplication before I even started like kindergarten.
Nice.
But at least I was able, what I could say that I knew how to count, I knew my colors, I knew almost already how to read a few words. So that made, but in Spanish, of course. So they placed me on ESL, the English as a second language program. And from the start, of course, you're set aside, especially in the 80s. And I already felt marginalized to a certain extent from what I remember because I didn't speak the language. So I felt I've always been an anxious child as well. So that just kind of maximized that sort of personality trait or just affect in me. And yeah, I just recall sometimes, I mean, I had some bad experiences when certain kids, but it's just kids being kids to a certain degree where they just make fun of your accent or just the lack of speaking the language well. But I also had people that were, really great friends that I made at that point. So that really helped kind of moderate, any sort of negativity that I was experiencing during those times. And I learned to basically kind of grow a hard shell. And when I heard any sort of comments about my accent, because I didn't get out of that program until I was in about fifth grade, I believe that's, or maybe even fourth grade, where they took me out of the program and I was just with the rest of the regular language arts and English classes. But yeah, eventually my accent went away, but just the overall experience of education being so different as well from my siblings, they were able to help me with homework assignments up to a certain point. Right. And I would say up to like fourth or fifth grade. And after that, I had to just figure it out. There's no other way to say it. I had to learn how to do my assignments on my own. Also, the language and just the culture, there was just a different disconnect. I would learn certain things at school, and then I would come home, and my mom would be like, "Nope, that's not how we do things here."
What sort of things can you remember?
Let me see. I mean, something simple as have just going over to your friend's house. My mom back then, especially when I was even in junior high, she just wanted me to come straight home afterwards because there was a point where she didn't pick me up anymore, but she expected me home by a certain time. And I would ask if I could go over to my friend's house, and her answer was always like, nope, nope. After a while, she explained to me that she already felt out of control just in US society as a whole, that she didn't know what sort of things I was experiencing. And I guess feeling that lack of control in general in her whole experience in the US, she at least wanted to make sure that she had control over specifically me, like her youngest child. So yeah, at those early years, I really didn't make the friends or the interactions I had with friends outside of the home just took place in school settings. I was not allowed to have any sleepovers and any. I think there might have been once or twice that she allowed a friend to come over, and I still felt like, yeah, my mom was just really conservative and just really cautious of what sort of conversations we were having. She was very vigilant. Now she's quite different. We all sort of evolved to be different people, but yeah, she back in the day, she was old school, kind of traditional Mexican Catholic mother. And to a certain extent, she's still like that. But yeah, back then it was just like, nope, you have to come here. This is my rules. And or anything like if I were to question anything about like the food or question anything about, because there's this whole thing to hierarchy within even siblings, at least in my family. And then I've heard in some Mexican culture, if you're the youngest, you have to basically listen to every single sibling that's older than you. So it ultimately it becomes like you have, in my case, 7 other parents. They're your father and mother figures on top of who I already had as my mom. So at least even though I didn't have a father figure in my life, I had a father figure, I should say, but I didn't have a father in my life. I felt that at least my brothers and my sisters, I never felt that need of, like, I can talk to someone about this, just things that you go through as a child trying to figure life out in general, those sort of things. At least I felt backed up by my siblings and my mom.
Sounds like you had an amazingly supportive home life. I mean, it sounds like you guys went through hell to get here. I can't imagine what it's like being a parent and having 8 children of all varying ages, trying to immigrate them piecemeal across a border. Sometimes illegally, sometimes legally. Must have been unbelievably stressful. So I can sympathize that when your mother got here and that better life was there in sight, she would be very, very reluctant to do anything that would jeopardize it, I can imagine. Yeah,
I mean, she doesn't like to talk a lot about the past, but I know that for me, it was also tough when I first got here with my aunt and uncle. My 2 of my sisters and my older brother were already here, but my mom couldn't come with me. So even though I don't remember specifically that day, I do remember the first few days of when I arrived at my aunt's house. And I was comfortable because I knew them and my cousins. But after a while, I just remember feeling really lonely and scared because, as a child, you're just used to being around your mother the whole time. And then right before I turned 4, I didn't have my mom for a couple of years until she was able to make it here. But
wow.
Yeah, so from my aunt's house, I would go to my sister's apartment that they lived with my other sister and my cousin. They worked at some sort of warehouse. I don't remember exactly what they did, but I remember going a few days with them and then a few days with my brother and his wife, and then go back. So they would just have me rotating until I started school. And I remember that my mom got here to the States right before I started, I believe, first grade.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but it was really difficult for her, of course, to send a 3-year-old, even though she knew that I was with family, away from her. That was really tough on her, as it was for me. But yeah, luckily everything, she came here, and then some of my other siblings a couple of years after were able to get here. But yeah, they all got here beyond the age of 15. Again, they all could sort of trickled in during different times in the 80s, but none of them had the opportunity that I had. And me being the youngest one, even though I went through those experiences, I felt that I was really, really fortunate to be sheltered from a lot of things. So I can't sit here and say that I ever felt hungry or that I ever had to sleep on the street or anything like that. I know that there's cases, unfortunately, that people that go through that. So at least I didn't have to go through that. But I think one of the main reasons why that was because we were a close-knit family. There was a lot of us. And then that support that we also had from other family members that had been here since the 70s.
So during that time and growing up, you're effectively an undocumented immigrant. Is that correct?
Yes.
No longer a citizen of Mexico?
Well, yeah. I mean, technically, I think I was a citizen of Mexico just because the only birth certificate I had was and is from Mexico. But I didn't, of course, have any other documentation besides that birth certificate before I arrived, to the States. So I don't know how far, and you want me to go, but in the sense that when it came down to my undocumented status, since the day I arrived here, right before I turned 4, all the way to the age of 39, that I was actually already given documentation. I was approved through my brother's petition, the older sibling that I have, who became a citizen eventually, and then filed to petition me at the age when I was 17. But because a few months afterwards I was going to turn 18, the whole waiting period would go to the original criteria of siblings, petitioning siblings, because the immigration gets really, I can't even thoroughly understand their laws, but I know that it just depends what country you are from and who petitioned you for a visa in order to know exactly what your waiting period is for the whole process to get fully documented.
So during that time where you're undocumented, which is ages 4 through 38, 39, how did that feel?
Well, I was like a shadow is always following me, or just this cloud, I should say, fear of always feeling like an imposter to a certain degree, I would say, because I always felt Mexican American, not just Mexican, because I had, grown here my entire life. I had learned the culture. I had values as well that I had adopted beyond my family that I was able to merge with my identity throughout my experience that I was also proud of, but at the same time felt ashamed of my status. Especially during the 90s, it was just something that you just didn't talk about. I didn't share my status with anybody because I was afraid that I was going to be judged. I did feel that shame. Yeah, and again, I was just fearful that at any point I can be caught somehow and be deported. But I didn't learn what that meant until I would say I was in high school. I remember it was one of those, forget what they call them, but it's supposed to set you up for like some sort of career
like a careers day or something like that.
Yeah, it was like a class that I had enrolled, but they gave you a certificate at the end. But for some reason, since it was supposed to be some sort of business certification that you know how to use these programs, they required your social security number. And at that point, the professor would go around at a certain time at the beginning of the semester and was getting everybody's social security number. I just remember that vividly. I didn't know what to say. I was like, I don't know. My mom or my brothers have never told me about anything. And then I went to ask, and then they told me, well, you don't have one. And they're like, basically, you don't have any documentation. And that's when I started realizing with that class. And then when people around me were getting their driver's license, I wasn't able to do any of that because, again, that's when I started seeing like, oh, I can't do none of this. I can't get a part-time job. And that's when the realization came in that, okay, you're gonna be having some barriers here in order for you to even do the things that young kids at your age are doing, such as getting a part-time and driving.
Which are kind of like they're things you need to survive in this day and age. I mean, I live in Southern California now, and getting around without a car is almost impossible.
Yeah.
Does that prevent you from getting a license? Did you just have to drive illegally, or
Oh
how
yeah.
yeah,
Yes,
okay.
I had to drive illegally for a good number of years until certain people that I was fortunate enough to meet in my path that were able to navigate through these issues, that I was able to get a driver's license eventually.
So how old were you when you got a driver's license?
God, let me see. How old was I? I believe I was like 28.
Wow. So,
Yeah.
roughly 10 years of driving unlicensed around the US.
Yes. And there was one time that I did get pulled over and got a driving without a license, but that was towards the end. Luckily, I was with a friend that we are coming back from work, and he was able to take the car back home. And the police were at least nice enough to not tow the car.
Right.
But that was back in the day.
Right.
Yeah,
I
things
don't think I've ever heard the police were actually nice enough
yeah,
sentence in the US yet. So that's a good story.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
things
definitely.
that people take for granted growing up in their own country is that I can get a license and I can get a job whenever I feel like it. I can travel, I can get a passport, all that sort of stuff.
Right,
Whereas you've sort of been denied that for really 3.5 decades,
right.
and not by choice.
And with my school ID, I got my first job at a shipping company. And that's what sort of sent me on that trajectory while I was going to school part time. And I paid myself through community college through a couple of AAs, a couple of degrees, associate degrees there. And I did like a mental health worker certification. I was just trying to make sure that I stayed engaged with academia because it was something that I always knew I wanted to do. Um, but I knew that financially I couldn't take the step to go to university just yet, because during that time I believe there wasn't much financial assistance. And even though again I had a social that was under my name, I still didn't want to push my luck and do certain things that I knew were gonna basically be a negative, that would have negative consequences once my time came to present myself at immigration with the interview and all these things.
When that did finally happen, was it a surreal experience going to immigration to become part of a country that you'd spent 95% of your life in?
Oh, definitely. I still didn't think it was real because again, my brother petitioned me when I was 17 and I didn't. And after that, it only took a couple of months to get the letter of approval, like, oh, you have been approved. Now you have to wait for your biometrics and, yada, 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 which is the next thing. And that literally took over over 20 years for that
Wow.
to actually come. And yes, so by the time I got that sort of notification, I went to get my biometrics. It was still sort of surreal. Like I still don't believe it until it actually comes through and things work out well. Yeah, it wasn't until I went to the interview, and I would have to say the immigration officer was also super nice and empathetic of the whole situation to a certain degree, where to her it was still also ridiculous, she said, of how long I had to wait based on my record, because of course they have your whole life in a folder when you show up to these interviews. So she was able to see my whole life trajectory and said that it's unfortunate that that's the case, but thankfully everything worked out with the interview and I was able to get my permanent residence back in 2020.
So it took from 1984 to 2020 to become a permanent residence.
Yes.
Wow, that is. And from your experience, is that a common story?
Yes, unless you have, if your parent does become a citizen, then it's easier, especially if you're underage. But even if you're not underage from here, like my mother could have sped up the whole process, but the issue is with her is that because of the life that she lived in Mexico, she never had any formal education whatsoever. She was one of the oldest of 12 children, so her job,
Wow.
since she could remember, was to take care of her siblings in the farm. So she never learned how to read or write. Basically, she was able to get her permanent residence, but to become a citizen, of course, there's different requirements which she wasn't able to fulfill at that point. So then that's why I had to go through my brother, who was a citizen, to speed things a little bit more, but it doesn't speed it up as much as if my mother would have done that. Yeah, again, it's normal for someone that is petitioned by a sibling who happens to be a citizen and who has came to the States during like the time frame that I did, or the time range that I
Wow.
did.
So looking back now with everything that you've gone through, and I guess living a life where, like you say, there's the shadow hanging over you for 3.5 decades. Do you think your mum made the right choice for a better life in the US?
Yes, I think so. Again, I was too young to understand what they were going through. I know that, of course, I would have tried to do the best that I could back in my country, or the country I was born. I should say, because it's at least I say my country because I feel close to the culture. My brothers and my mom did a great job of keeping those values and sort of that belief system, at least the positives. Did a good job of cultivating in me. So yeah, I think that she did, because again, it was just really hard for her financially, just making ends meet. And again, my brother was already here, her family was already here, and she was just felt less, she just felt like there wasn't enough incentives for her to keep us there in Mexico, and just saw that it was just we were gonna have more opportunity. And I think she made a great choice, and it was worth going through what we have gone through, because I mean, we're very fortunate. We have our family kept on growing. I have over 20 nephews and nieces now.
Wow.
Some of them already have their master's degrees, are professionals in their field. So I very much think that it was worth it, because at least we were able to, better our lives and become better people, and just in general. And I myself feel, even though it took forever, I'm still living, my dream of going into a PhD program and being halfway done with it. I can't be any more thankful for my mom making that decision. But yeah, it was definitely a journey, to say the very least.
And during that time, I assume that you didn't have a passport, and that even if you had, traveling outside of the US would very well have meant you wouldn't be able to get back in.
Exactly. Yeah.
Did you ever think about returning to Mexico?
Never to live, but I always, of course, felt like that sort of feeling like, oh, I want to go. And especially when in my 20s and friends were going down to like Rosarito or Ensenada and all that stuff, I was like, man, that sounds like fun. I want to go. But I knew that the getting back would be the major issue. So that always deterred me. But I never had the motivation, and up to this point, of going back and living there, because I really don't have any family there.
Yeah.
Not anybody that I'm close to. So now that, I had my passport for 2 years and my permanent residence, so I could perfectly fine just for me to go and come back. I eventually, of course, want to go, but again, it's been already over 2 years, and I still haven't gone.
What about your brothers and sisters who spent a little bit more time there before? Because I mean, again, you were three, so home is the US for you as far as your living memory is concerned. But for your brothers and sisters who your oldest brother was already married in Mexico, Have they ever returned?
Oh yeah, they have, because that's something that I didn't. One of the reasons why I was still undocumented and most of my siblings were not was because when they came here as teenagers, they worked at like at a farm somewhere, and since they did, they were able to get amnesty during the 80s. But I, of course, since I was super young, I didn't
Yeah.
work on the farms. I didn't get any letter. So I was the one that, I didn't get any I wasn't qualified. I didn't fit that criteria for amnesty. So my brothers did get eventually their permanent residence and eventually their citizenship. So they've been going back to Mexico since the 90s.
It's
Yeah.
a
Uh-huh.
it's a funny twist of fate that your siblings got their citizenship and their permanent residency before you, but
Yep.
you're the one who got the American education and grew up in America and sort of lived the life of a young person growing up in the US.
Yeah.
And yet you didn't get your citizenship or permanent residency until a long time later.
Yeah, that's sort of the ironic twist to it, or and the trade-off, I guess, because in some ways I've had it easier than them, and then in some ways they had it easier than myself. So those are that's the way that the perspective that I like to see it. That yeah, they did have their documentation, but they still struggled in different ways to get assimilated to living here to the States, and things that I didn't have to experience that were negative as well. So again, I feel fortunate regardless of all the struggles and all the fear attached to that experience itself. In some way, I think it also helped me build, character and perseverance and just trying to stay positive. So those are, I guess, the things that this whole experience shaped in me.
Well, it sounds like family is such an important part of this journey as well. I can't. I can only speak for myself, but I mean, I've gone through the journey with just one person, my wife. But you, as a young person going through that journey without your siblings, without your aunt and uncle, without your mother, it sounds like it would have been an absolutely impossible journey.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I've always had a really supportive network, and yeah, like I said, you feel like I felt like I had a bunch of parents, but at the same time, that also comes with its rewards, in which you feel supported in different ways. That I felt like I had a family network where I could ask different members different questions based on what I was going through. I also had cousins that were older than me that, even though I wasn't super close to them, there was times where I could at least ask them certain things that were helpful to make sense of my whole experience. I know that if I didn't have them all in my life, it would have been a completely different journey, and most likely I wouldn't be where I'm at today. I'm in complete agreement with what you say, that if it wasn't for them and that network, it would have been impossible to go through this whole journey.
So, when you were growing up, you talk about not feeling like you were different because of language barriers and because of cultural barriers. Do you have an early memory of the first time you kind of felt American?
Yeah, I would say it happened more in my high school years. We moved to a city that's really close to Orange County, borderline Orange County, LA County, that had a very diverse population. And at the same time, I was living, a few of my siblings and my mother were living with one of my older brothers, who married someone who grew up here in the States, who moved here from Cuba as a teenager. My sister-in-law, who was and is still extremely influential in my life. And since she had gone through somewhat of a similar experience assimilating to the States, she became a huge role model and navigating, especially during high school. It was that pivotal moment where a couple of years, she came into my life a couple of years before I started high school, but when we moved to La Mirada, that city that I'm telling you, was when it all sort of started aligning, where I started feeling more of my identity be more towards Mexican American, or just feeling an American, was there, where she started teaching me different ways of being and thinking and understanding the world beyond what my immediate family taught me. And then through her, I met one of her nephews who, was my best friend. We're not as close now, but was my best friend for years. And we did everything together. And along with him was another group of other three friends that they were all from like Cuban American families. They would come over every weekend and we would just play out in the street, whether it might be basketball or football or baseball. But we would have a group, at least about 5 or 6 of us, just playing from, especially on the weekends, from mornings till night. I was became really engaged with sports. Those experiences and during that time was what sort of solidified my like American identity.
Well, nothing's more American than not caring about soccer and caring about baseball.
Right? How funny things change afterwards. Now that I'm older, I now see the value, because even during those times, I mean, not to go too much into that experience of solidifying my American identity, and then also feeling ashamed of my undocumented status, I sort of started pushing away my culture, my Mexican culture. I started, and now I feel bad even just thinking about it, but I felt ashamed of being Mexican, and to the point where, since I grew up also with Cubans, I would even say, "Oh, I'm half Cuban or something," because it seems like I didn't feel comfortable in that identity at that point. But after being educated and after understanding so many different things and seeing things from different perspective, broader perspective, and realizing all the positives that come with being part of Mexican culture, I've learned of the value that it has had and the impact it's had in my life in so many positive ways. So I've grown to love that part of me.
It's interesting you talk about wanting to distance yourself from your Mexican heritage around your high school age. And I think that's a really common thing for kids who are dual citizen, or have parents from different backgrounds, or like yourself, were born in one country but grew up in another, to kind of rebel against what's probably the old school part of those two cultures. What's the new bit, what's the exciting bit, what's the bit that's different, what's the bit that's different to mum and dad. So I can totally see why you would go down that path, and I'm glad you've reconnected with it again in your adult life. That's really cool.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's something that at first it was difficult to navigate, but I think it was also because of my inexperience in life in general, just my lack of perspective, just feeling again that fear and that shame that came with the status just didn't make it any easier to adopt these values that in some way seem to be a hindrance to the eyes of others, specifically people, from the States. At least in my eyes, that's how I saw it. It's like, this isn't a positive. Yeah, eventually life taught me that that's not the case, and that there's so many great things, and that it's only, ignorant people or just laws that are unfair that bring about these sort of emotions or perspectives within people, that have a similar experience.
Did you grow up thinking that being Mexican was bad?
To a certain degree, I wouldn't say like, oh, it's bad, but one of the things that I do remember was that, because I also grew up in a very religious, like Catholic family, the whole sort of like Mexican American pocho, like especially like any affiliation with or relation with being associated with a cholo, was always looked down upon by all my family. So it was something that we just didn't want to be associated with, or So any reference to being like stereotyped in that sort of pocket, it was something that I really didn't want to be associated with. And I always would in some way think that it was their doing why they're in gangs, they're doing, like, I didn't see the systematic sort of oppression that goes on in society, specifically in lower SES, socioeconomic status neighborhoods, that bring about choices that young people make to lead them to that sort of life. But in other words, if there was any sort of people or ashamed that feeling ashamed was of, it was that specific group of people. But again, it was just my lack of understanding, and it was just easier to do since it was something that I was taught my family, like, oh, you don't want to be like a cholo, or don't shave your head, or don't wear these baggy pants, or don't grow your goatee this way.
I'm starting to get a picture, but for the Australian in the room, what's a cholo?
Okay, a cholo is someone that is part of a Mexican American, usually stereotypically, because it could even go beyond that, but stereotypically, it usually is a Mexican American person who is in a gang. And then what they do is either like steal or tag up, or graffiti, that is, tag up their neighborhood and have sort of territorial wars with other gangs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And that
So
was
that's-
obvious, an image you were very keen to stay away from.
Yes. Something that I was always reminded of, like, my siblings always told me, you were the only one that came here at such a young age. You need to make the best of it. So I always had that in the back of my head, and I always try to do the right thing. And it wasn't until like my late teenage years that I sort of rebelled from that whole orientation, just general functioning. And I questioned a lot of things after that. And the same thing, to a similar vein, was religion. I just didn't, I questioned everything. And that was a big thing too within my family. But now at least we respect each other's views. But to this day, of course, my sort of perspective in life is very different from my siblings. They're more traditional, even though they, of course, are Latinos. They still are very conservative in their beliefs, especially rooted in Catholicism. Their ways of thinking are sometimes sharply distinct from my beliefs. I feel like there's a lot of great lessons that you could find in religious literature and allegories and all that stuff that are really helpful and can be good ways of teaching values and morals within a certain belief system. But I don't think that any religion is like a panacea.
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned a while ago that your immigration during the 80s was different to what people experience now. How else has America changed in your lifetime?
Well, at least now, I always try to remember what I told you all at the beginning about how I didn't disclose my undocumented status basically to anyone unless I felt that they were really close and I trusted them. And it was because of the culture itself. I felt that it was something on the news, just the way that it was talked about. It's like, oh, you should be ashamed if. So we were in the shadows. Undocumented people were in the shadows. And now at least you could see that there's support out there, social support especially, and young people are making a huge difference in how undocumented people are viewed, especially dreamers. I barely cut the tail, or at the beginning, I would say, or I don't even know how to say that, but I didn't fit the dreamers criteria. For instance, for the DACA, I was literally a couple of months too old to apply when the DACA law came into effect, where, if you grew up being a dreamer, again, someone that came here to the States at a somewhat young age, graduated high school, then you were eligible for DACA. for early child arrivals. I think that's what it is. I fit a different criteria. I was still able to get assistance. That's the way I was able to eventually transfer to university. That was the only time that I was able to get government assistance, and it was through the state of California, of course, not federal assistance. But it was because I fit that AB 540, I think that's what it's called, AB 540 status, which is just someone that is a bit too old to be in the DACA.
Right.
And because of that, of course, I wasn't able to. With DACA, I believe you're able to get your driver's license and even work. I think there's even special cases where you could even leave the States, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow.
At least it was back then until things now, like, again, the whole DACA thing is being or was being questioned not too long ago. But yeah, at least now I feel that there's resources also for people that are undocumented that you could go and you get information, support groups and all that. Back when I started, for instance, community college, there was none of that. When I started community college, fees were 3 times as much per unit.
Wow.
So you paid 3 times as much. And back then, I mean, I was lucky that it was just $12 a unit back then, I think it was. So it wasn't terrible. So it was like 36 instead per unit as opposed to 12.
Mm. I imagine that's a lot more expensive these days.
Oh yeah, I hear that now. I don't even know how much they charge, but I think it's close to $100 a unit now at the very least.
Yeah.
Or 80 something. So yeah, at least it's become more accessible. People feel more comfortable talking about it, because it wasn't until I transferred into university and became a member of a transfer underrepresented minorities program that I felt like I had a supportive community, and young people were outspoken and really brave to come out of the shadows. And that was like the pivotal moment of me being like, it's okay to say that this is my status. It's okay not to feel ashamed. And that's when I saw others do it, that I gained the bravery to speak out and be like, hey, this is my status. And I became more comfortable talking about it. But yeah, it was quite a struggle. It definitely affected my romantic relationships, for lack thereof, because I always felt that at some point I would have to bring this up. And it was always in back of my head of like, okay, how am I going to bring this up? Are they going to see me differently, or they're not going to want to date me because of this? So that really made my whole sort of dating life even more difficult.
It's just that extra layer of stress. I would imagine it was a huge relief to then know there are other people like you saying it's okay to be like this, when previously you might have really just felt like you're on your own.
Yes, I think that's when I think when people gain different perspectives, when they realize that they're not alone in life or in whatever circumstances that they're in, it feels like no one can relate and no one understands how you feel. And it's not until you hear someone that has had a similar experiences or has been in a similar situation that kind of opens up your eyes that you're not alone, that there are other people that have going through what you're going through, or if not even worse. And that sort of brings up the whole notion that that you're not alone, that there's people there that can support you and hear you out. And that was really important for me to hear and experience. So I'm really happy that I was able to transfer eventually and be part of that program, because that was something pivotal again in changing my perspective and just the way that I felt about myself, my identity. It really made me feel accepted and wanted as well.
That's awesome. So what advice would you give to young undocumented people who might be going through what you're going through, or what you've been through?
I would say to confide in those that you trust, and also be cognizant of the advice they give you, that it's appropriate for the choices that you need to make in life. But even though that's really vague, I would say something more concrete is just trying to expand your network and realizing that your status does not define you and your character. that it's only just a life circumstance that you have to deal with. And it's just a matter of connecting with people in the best way that you can and make genuine connections and try to stay positive. I think that has helped me out. I know that to some, it could be a hindrance because it could set you up for deception, and it also depends on your network. The key is to know that you're not alone and to know that there's help and support that you can gain as long as you also put the effort in connecting with those people and resources.
So, man, thank you for like sharing your story today and giving me an insight. I mean, I'm going through immigration as well, but nothing like what you've had to experience. You know, COVID was its own separate beast, but you know, if I had to wait 36 years for my documents, I'd be I wouldn't have the patience to stick around. I'll say that much. Before we say goodbye, I would just love to ask you, what is something about America you think everybody needs to experience?
No, first of all, before we go to just thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that this, kind of entertains people, but also helps others in similar circumstances. But yeah, when it comes down to, I'm big on just on trips out to nature. So for me, I would say that visiting the Sequoia National Park and also the Yosemite Park are must. Some, it also depends on, I guess, your age range and all this stuff where it's accessible more for kids and all that. But for instance, the Sequoia National Park has access, even grandma or young kids can walk and find these huge, beautiful trees that really make you feel small and just, but in a good way, of course, make that whole sense of feeling small and just part of the bigger world that we are, and feel connected with nature. So
I'll have to go to Sequoia Park, and is that the giant redwoods, those big trees?
yes.
Yeah,
Exactly right.
I mean, it is actually genuinely already on the list of things I need to go and do while I'm here, but it sounds incredible.
Yes, you definitely should.
Well, Rudy, thank you so much for sharing your story, man. I really loved hearing it, and yeah, you know, 36 years, but here's to your citizenship, man, and here's to whatever the next steps in your life are going to be.
Thank you very much again for having me. And yeah, I really enjoyed our conversations.
According to the Migration Policy Institute of America, at time of recording, there was an estimate of 11,047,000 undocumented, unauthorized people living in the United States of America. So it's a large number of people. It's not, as some politicians have said recently on Twitter, 6 billion people. And I get the billions and millions can be tricky. They rhyme, but once you start putting the zeros on the end and adding them up, there's a substantial difference. But it is still a lot of people. It's 3.3% of the population of the United States. 3.3%. And they're doing a lot of the work that middle-class Americans don't want to do. And I'm not here to throw stones in glass houses, because I, by virtue of being Australian, come from a country that handles immigration, asylum seekers, and refugees very poorly. We are infamous for it. And I don't think America is doing anything better or worse than what Australia is doing in terms of how it's handling the influx of asylum seekers and refugees and people crossing borders illegally. But that's a lot of people working their asses off to not only try and better their own lives, but also working on building a future in this country, putting down roots, starting families. Listening to Rudy's story, how many of his family have gone on to get their master's degrees and become professionals living in America, contributing to society. And one thing that always struck me about Rudy the whole time he's talking is that, yeah, like he's had it rough, and he's had an unusual set of circumstances that most of us can't relate to, but he doesn't hold any resentment. He's not angry. He's just here to just live and do his best, and that's a beautiful thing. Next week is another deeply personal story. I'm talking to Crystal, who's sharing her experience of growing up black in the South and her experience with what it means to be black in America these days. It's another beautiful story. I was very moved by it, and I really hope you'll listen to it, because for me, what comes from this conversation changed the way I interact with people. And that is not hyperbole. That's the God's honest truth. So I very much hope you'll join me next week. Until then, I've been John David Easterling. This has been Unpacking America. Please stay safe out there.